One. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Daily Objective. Today it's me, Daniel, and joining me is James Valliant. James, how are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. Recovering a little bit from an illness, but I think I'm recovering okay. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I've been dealing with something for a couple of days, but it's better now, so I'm all good. So
Hey,
today,
we're both here, but it's a dark day. What creepy proceedings are happening in the United Nations this very
so
day? Oof.
before I release you, let me just tell people what we're going to talk about. So we were supposed to talk about the International Court of Justice, and we might mention it a little bit at the end if there's time, but much more pressing. There's two big stories that happened. One that was released on Monday is Biden administration is thinking about some sort of proposal for a ceasefire. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but much more pressing was the UN security vote again. And for ceasefire, the vote happened just a couple of hours ago. US did veto it because they believed that even if they want ceasefire, the Biden administration, they still think it should be negotiated a bit more. This specifically was proposal from the Arabic countries, I believe Algeria specifically. And let me just give you a little bit about it. So, in addition to the ceasefire they called for, this Arab-backed draft resolution demands an immediate release of, it said, all hostages. I was wondering if it meant Palestinian hostages, and then I learned it actually means only Palestinian hostages. It doesn't even mention the Israeli hostages. So this ceasefire doesn't even call for the release of the Israeli hostages in Gaza. It also rejects the forced displacement of the Palestinian civilians, calls for unhindered humanitarian access, and reiterates Council demands that Israel and Hamas scrupulously comply with international law, especially the protection of civilians. Without naming either party, it condemns all acts of terrorism. So equating uh, civilized Western countries such as Israel to a literal terrorist organization such as Hamas, and again equating October 7 attacks to Israel's rightful defense in Gaza. So James, what do you think about all this? What do you think about this proposal and the vote itself?
Well, Algeria is currently a member of the United Nations Security Council, and their proposal was backed by all of the Arab nations, of course, in the Arab coalition within the United Nations. And they called and none of these resolutions calling for ceasefire. We've had now numerous UN resolutions over the last few months for a ceasefire. None of them have included the release of the hostages taken on 7 October. None of them. None of them. So, in other words, they're demanding, the world is still demanding, that Israel do a complete ceasefire, even as the Hamas terrorists and Islamic Brotherhood still have people in Gaza. Now, that is as repulsive as you could imagine. That is a total sanction. In effect, the United Nations is taking Hamas's side. It's not just UNRWA, it's the United Nations as a whole. Consider three-quarters of the General Assembly, three-quarters of the member states in the General Assembly have called for a ceasefire without conditions like releasing hostages, as if that would be good enough. No, the idea is that the defender has a complete right to eliminate the threat and the potential of the threat. Until that happens, you are continuing to sanction the violence. You are equating the two. The United Nations has officially become, through all of this, now, mind you, it took them, as we've noted several times already on this program, before they even took up the case of the systematic use of rape. The systematic use, there is a UN organization that was supposed to look into this. It took them weeks and weeks and weeks before they even decided to take up the issue of the violence that was done against women and children on 7 October. It's just this one organization. But the United Nations has never condemned 7 October. And yet the United Nations is demanding Israel stop the complete destruction, at least of Hamas. If you allow, and President Biden is disgusting on this. He did not want, and he's already signaled Israel, he did not want Israel to go into Rafah, to complete the attack against Hamas, take out the Sinwar, who was the operative leader who planned October 7th, who we have good reason to believe is there in Rafah. So without completing their, let's put it this way, going over every square centimeter of Gaza, which Israel, of course, has a right to do, before doing that, what you'd be doing is to be assuring the survival of Hamas. Now consider that, President Biden. Your appeasement caused October 7th. Your appeasement caused October 7th, Mr. Biden. You wanted a deal with Iran, so you de-designated the Houthis as terrorists. You opened up negotiations. You allowed Iran to get billions and billions in trade for its oil. You yourself engaged in hostage negotiations with Iran. By wanting this deal with Iran so much, by what Biden set up October 7th, almost necessitated something like October 7th, because Iran, by its nature, and Hamas, by its nature, want Israel destroyed. That's their stated goal. Iran has been supplying weapons to Hamas to do this. And without recognizing the connection there, Mr. Biden, and by calling for a ceasefire, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, Iran, resupply Hamas, let Hamas grow and continue. Let's have more October 7th. So Biden's policy is continuing the policy of appeasement that helped cause October 7th. Biden does not realize the error of his ways. But backing up further, using the United Nations, which we now know, now get this, America vetoes and vetoes and vetoes all of these resolutions. It vetoed the one today that Algeria proposed for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. In even vetoing it, in even participating in this, and now in proposing, as America has, its alternative resolution for a temporary ceasefire as soon as is practicable, is the way the language of the U.S. has proposed resolution on this goes, as soon as is practically possible, and calling on Israel not to attack Rafah. What they're doing is they're sanctioning the entire organization. They're sanctioning the entire group whose resolutions they had to veto and veto and veto and veto and veto. So in other words, the United States is willing to use this evil organization whose resolutions we have consistently vetoed because we thought they were morally wrong. So this group that is officially and consistently morally wrong on Israel, the United States is willing to use those channels of international law, in effect, to shut down Israel. That is stabbing Israel fully in the back. I cannot imagine a more disgusting move by the part of the United States government. Just about the only government in the world that has even semi had Israel's back on all of this has just lodged a deep knife into the back of Israel, as far as I can see. This it could only mean, in my view, that Israel needs to step away from the United Nations as such. We are, in effect, forcing Israel to denounce morally the UN. Now, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I see Israel still there in front of the Court of International Justice, pleading with an organization. Now, the Wall Street Journal just today had a article on how the head of the International Court of Justice, this Lebanese jurist, has been long an enemy of Israel, has long been one of these Islamicist legal minds, and that's who's in charge of the International Court of Justice today. Someone overtly hostile to Israel, who has been hostile for years. And I hope we can provide the Wall Street Journal link in the links. They're demanding that Israel suffer. In effect, the United States is currently demanding that Israel suffer more October 7th because they can't distinguish between good and evil, between the aggressor and the defender here, because they give moral sanction to these monsters and have for how long?
Yeah, we've definitely seen, specifically after October 7, at least some rise in criticism of the UN, specifically when you think about leaving the UN. One big surprise when it comes to October 7 and specifically Israel was the Czech Republic, where actually I believe it was the defense minister even called for the Czechia to withdraw from the UN for their strong attacks against Israel, straight up attacks, no actual justification. But let's go a little back and talk talk more about. So the vote happened, and then of course all sides tried to all representatives had some sort of comments. So there was a Palestinian representative for the state of Palestine. Uh, we who had some interesting comments. One of the comments which I found really insightful. That's what I love when there is someone who is so opposite of you that what they are saying is actually true. Because he said the history is going to judge the council harshly.
Hmm.
Yes, the
Yes.
history is going to judge this
For
council very
considering
harshly.
each and every one of these ceasefire proposals without officially denouncing what happened on October 7th. Now, mind you, the UN Security Council has not unequivocally denounced what happened on October 7th. That has not happened. Consider history. History will look at the UN organization as one that says, hey, okay, no problem there to October 7th. All of those atrocities, none of them are worth official condemnation by the UN Security Council or by the United Nations as a whole, but Israel's actions in self-defense, those must stop immediately. Those are evil. Those are genocide. Those are violations of international law. What kind of a twisted, perverse, upside down world in which the United Nations, a truly evil organization, cannot find it in itself to denounce officially October 7th, and yet repeatedly has the, like I say, the General Assembly voted 3/4 of the nation states voted to denounce Israel's actions in self-defense. No, the United Nations is an aggressive organization hostile to the state of Israel. It supports the destruction of Israel by implication. And now the United States is going to use this organization to pressure Israel not to attack Rafah. That's exactly what's going on. Now, I understand that the United States is not demanding an immediate vote on its temporary ceasefire resolution. It's kind of dragging its feet and it's going to wait to see what happens. But through official and unofficial channels, Biden has been telling Netanyahu, do not attack Rafah. Do not attack Rafah. And that means let the guy most guilty for October 7th go off scot-free. Let Hamas survive. Make sure there's more October 7th. That is unfortunately my government's official policy. It is a policy which has been bloodstained from the beginning because its appeasement of Iran helped cause October 7th. And rather than face up to our culpability, the United States' culpability in all of the atrocities that happened on October 7th, we're now using the organization that fails to denounce that and is fighting Israel's every step in trying to defend itself. Morally, that is, of course, unspeakable.
UN truly makes a good place for any kinds of terrorists and dictators and authoritarians, because and I never know if I'm actually surprised or if I shouldn't be about the comments specifically made by this representative for Palestine. He even said we need real consequences for Israel. He even described the one thing he mentioned is we are still in 70 years of Nakba. So not only he considers, for those who don't mean, Nakba means a catastrophe. So not only he considers the founding of Israel a catastrophe, but the mere existence, the fact that Israel is still around, he still considers that and a catastrophe. So it's not about the civilians dying. It's not about anything like that. It's about Israel existing.
It's the existence of Israel. That's what they keep saying over and over. That's what Iran says over and over. That's what Hezbollah, Hamas say over and over and over. That's what all of these Iranian proxies in the area say over and over. And that is what the United Nations is officially sanctioning. Now, get this. To negotiate for the hostages is obscene, is an absolute obscenity. It encourages the taking of more hostages. It morally sanctions the taking of hostages. And what the United States' position is, well, we don't want, right now, we don't want to call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We want a temporary ceasefire so we can negotiate more through our Qatari intermediaries the release of the hostages. And on this matter, Ayn Rand, of course, has an amazing quote right on target from her article, Doesn't Life Require Compromise? A compromise is an adjustment of conflicting claims by mutual concessions. This means that both parties to a compromise have some valid claim and some value to offer each other. And this means both parties agree to some fundamental principle which serves as the base for their deal. There is no value to be obtained other than more violence. You say the value is the lives of these hostages. No, what you just pointed out is exactly it. What we're negotiating over is your right, Hamas's right to absolutely destroy Israel and to unrelentingly keep that up and to continue with October 7th. When we engage in compromises with the hostage takers, when the rest of the world would demand a ceasefire without the hostages gone, but even the Americans in saying, oh, we'll give you what you want, survival, Hamas, the killers of October 7th can get away with it. The ringleader can get away with it if you just give us back the hostages you've still got. The innocent hostages you've still got. Without the United Nations saying, obviously there could be, now look, obviously, if it was a semi-sane organization on October 8th, the United Nations would have unanimously said, until and unless Hamas releases all the hostages and renounces all future violence against Israel, we are not even going to start about talking about Hamas. Israel has a green light to take out utterly Hamas. We do not, as John Galt says, reduce ourselves to the level of these savages in responding with violence. What we do is we treat them as they are demanding to be treated. And if we don't do that, then if it's one-sided, we're not going to fight back, then what you're doing is you're saying, green light, go to all the aggressive violence. That's all it can be. That's all it is. It's a moral and obviously a material sanction, because even were there a temporary ceasefire, that would, of course, give Hamas breathing space. They can adjust where their leaders are. They can get resupplied from Iran. More ships can come. Oh, have to note this. The Houthis are still, of course, on the march. Nothing that Biden or Britain has done so far has obviously dissuaded the Iranian proxies from their aggression. So
yeah,
while they're still on the,
one ship was sunk only a couple days ago, or I'm not sure if sunk specifically, but taking over where the crew had to pretty much escape. It was a British ship.
A British ship,
still
yes.
very much
and French are now firing back and so forth. There are still attacks going on in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. In other words, the stuff that the West has done so far has done zero to dissuade the aggressors here, who are trying to stop international shipping. No, it's absolutely obscene. We're submitting to the aggressors. We're negotiating with the evil aggressors. Rather than permanently incapacitating the aggressors, rather than isolating Iran or attacking Iran, what we're saying is Israel is the one who has to stop. Israel has to show restraint. This is moral inversion of the most perverse kind.
Let's talk a little bit about the Israeli representative comments. He actually was pretty good on this subject. He called ceasefire this silver bullet that somehow magically will solve everything. But as he said, it will really achieve nothing. It will not do anything about the Hamas, not do anything about the Houthis, not do anything about the Hezbollah or Iran. Unfortunately, he made a little bit of an appeal to the ICJ. For those who don't know, the International Kangaroo Judiciary. Oh, I'm sorry, the International Court of Justice, of course.
IK. We should replace this C with a K, kangaroo, or add a K.
Wait,
kangaroo,
I thought kangaroo is spelled with a C.
Brilliant.
But
no, it's truly evil. Truly evil, as we've discussed with the just even Israel appearing there and offering a defense was a moral sanction of this truly evil organization, which, as I say, is now headed by a jurist from Lebanon who's been anti-Israel their entire life. No, obviously you denounce the entire court of justice. They have no grounds for even bringing a charge of genocide with conventional weapons. Had that been the motive of Israel, they could have wiped out the population of Gaza by now, just with conventional weapons. Never in the history of warfare has a nation been so surgical in its defensive operations as Israel. And yet the explicit goal, the outright stated goal of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, is the utter destruction of Israel. They want genocide by their explicit statements. More than that, they keep lobbing rockets, they keep doing 7 Octobers, and so long as they do that, uh, all we're doing in asking Israel to show restraint is to suffer more, as they surely must suffer more if the United Nations gets what it wants. So the ICJ is evil. We know UNRWA is an evil arm, a participant in the activities of October 7th. They are supporting ideologically and materially the very terrorists who perpetrated October 7th. So the United Nations is an organization, until it realizes it's part of the problem, until it takes the blame for its appropriate share of the blame for the 7th of October atrocities, until it can face up to the fact that it is calling for genocide. No, the United Nations officially supports genocide. Any sanction of the United Nations is a sanction of genocide. And I will state it that strongly. Any effort by the United States to get any kind of resolution against Israel, even for a temporary, when practicable, temporary ceasefire, is itself conceding to the principles. You see, there is no room for negotiation here. There is no room for compromise, as Ayn Rand points out. The minute we start entering the negotiations for compromise on the issue of on an issue so clearly morally black and white of this kind, we have in effect sanctioned the killers. We've sanctioned an organization that wants the genocide of Jews. The United Nations, by a vote of 3/4 of its assembly, wants the destruction of Israel. Any country that participates in the United Nations and gives it legitimacy is on the side of October 7th.
Yeah, I think a great point would be when one nation finally leaves the United Nations, because then it might actually give some sort of it might inspire some other nations, hopefully such as Israel or the US, to actually leave.
Well, that one
Maybe they'll
minister you
find
mentioned, that
maybe they
one
will
minister
found
you
some.
mentioned, I mean, is the one minister in any civilized country I've heard so far saying such a thing. You know, Mr. Trump, as he's saying, the other day, you might have caught it. Mr. Trump said that if a member state of the United Nations has not met its obligations under for funding of its own defense under NATO, it would encourage Russia to invade NATO states. Now, rather than undermining NATO, Mr. Trump, why don't you start with the United Nations? That organization supports all these Putins and Xi's, these dictators you think are buddies you can get along with and cut deals with, Mr. Trump. No, no, no. It's member states of the United Nations, or excuse me, of NATO that he's after. He's not after the United Nations. But if you had if you knew a principle, Mr. Trump wouldn't know a principle that bit him in the butt. But if he had an ounce of principle, he would be denouncing the United Nations and saying America will get out of the United Nations, stop funding the United Nations altogether, based on what happened on October 7th. You know, everyone says Trump's a big friend of Israel. He can really show it here by denouncing the ICJ, by denouncing UNRWA, by threatening America's entire funding for this evil organization, the United Nations. I call on Trump, if he has the so-called Israel, if he is supposed to be the one who has Israel's back, I call on him to denounce the United Nations and pull funding from the United Nations, not just UNRWA and not just a denunciation of the International Court of Justice, the Kangaroo Court of Injustice, but threaten to pull America's funding from the United Nations. Nothing short of that will do, and anything short of that is a sanction of the violence.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Trump comments about Israel. So there was a comment by Richard Goldberg, a former official during the Trump administration. The United States should be vetoing pro-Hamas resolutions, not proposing them. By putting forward the resolution calling for a ceasefire and opposing IDF action in Rafah, the White House is effectively pushing for Hamas to survive to massacre another day. This is a complete betrayal of U.S. interests and values. And but we keep hearing from Blinken that U.S. fully stands behind Israel's action, but I'm not so sure about that.
No, they don't. Right now, the United States is high pressuring Israel not to attack Rafah. And whatever winking, blinking, and nod says, or whatever President Biden rolls around in his senile head, it's obvious what they're doing. They're supporting the Palestinian terrorists, and full stop. And any negotiation with them, of course, is a complete sanction of the hostage taking, is to reward the hostage taking. For Lord Cameron, the British foreign minister, has already proposed that Britain recognize a Palestinian state upon ceasefire, and that would be absolutely rewarding, giving in effect the Palestinian terrorists everything they want, a reward for 7 October. Wow. No, I'm afraid Israel, you're on your own here. Attack Rafah, ignore Britain, ignore the United States, ignore the United Nations as the evil institution that it is, ignore the International Court of Justice, withdraw your support from that. You'll be alone. You'll have our support. You'll have my moral support. But the question is, do they have the backbone? Does Netanyahu have the backbone to denounce the United Nations and all of its affiliates? Because that's what needs to happen. Whereas the West right now, the United States and Britain, are using this evil United Nations organization, which is overtly hostile to the very existence of Israel. The United Nations is a pro-genocide. I've said they're a dictatorship protection racket, a terrorism protection racket. No, I'm going to go so far as to say, as of now, they're clearly pro-genocide, Jewish genocide. The United Nations is officially in favor of the destruction of Israel. There's no other way of looking at it.
And we will be talking more about this on our other show, the reality show, coming up in just a few minutes. Link is in the chat. Make sure to go there right after this. Something I wanted to wrap up. Oh yeah, so there we will be focusing more about the Israel sort of actions in Rafah, their plans, where when they think they will want to attack, what are their demands specifically to Hamas. So we'll cover more sort of long range aspects of this. So you have about 2.5 minutes, and then we'll start there. Thanks, James, for joining me today. Thank you, everyone, and bye bye.